But Flu's point is not so much to prove whether there's a gardener or not as to focus on the methodology issues. And that's why I want to use this story here. To what extent is the debate in this case going to be driven by people's commitment to being scientific, to attending to and letting the observational data speak to the hypotheses in question. Now in this case, the hypothesis is that what we have here is a garden with a gardener competing with the hypothesis that there is no garden and there is no gardener. So we have a debate and then they say, okay, well, let's be scientific about this. We should be able to put this to the test. And then we think, here's the following kind of test. If there is in fact a gardener, then sooner or later the guy has to show up in order to tend to his garden. So one test that we can run is just to camp out here for a while. We'll enjoy the beauty of the garden and we'll just wait and see whether a gardener shows up. If he does, then that's confirmation of the gardener hypothesis. And if he doesn't, then that also will tell us. So they camp out there for a week, for 2 weeks, a month. Nobody shows up, but everything is going on as usual here. And then at the end of the month, the skeptic says, see, I told you there is no gardener. This is not really a gardener. The guy who believes, though, in the gardener hypothesis, oh, that test doesn't prove anything. The reason why we didn't see the gardener is he's an invisible gardener. It's an invisible gardener who's coming by on a fairly regular basis, tending to the garden, but we're trying to see him with our eyes and listen to him with our ears. But since he's invisible, he's not going to be susceptible to being seen. And so that's why we didn't see the guy. But I'm convinced still that there really is a gardener here. So the skeptic says, well, all right, so now we're talking about an invisible gardener, but we still have to be scientific about this. How would we test for, say, an invisible gardener? And so the guy makes a proposal. This turns out to be very well equipped jungle travelers. Suppose they say, well, let's take these thousands of feet of electrical wire that we have with us in this little generator, and what we'll do is we'll rig a tripwire all around this area and run an electric current through it, and we'll set it up so that if the wire is tripped, that a little bell or some sort of buzzer will go off and we'll be alerted that somebody has tripped the wire. So even if we don't see the guy, nonetheless, he's going to be a being who will trip the wire and we'll be able to detect and indirectly observe him through his interacting with this tripwire system that we're going to install here. So they agree that they will run that particular experiment and they'll wait for the observational data to come in. So they wait a week, they wait 2 weeks, they wait a month, and nothing except a few animals that they're able independently to verify trips the tripwire. And so at the end of the month, the skeptic then is saying, see, I told you there is no gardener. This garden is just a self-regulating natural set of systems here. And the guy who believes in the gardener hypothesis says, well, that doesn't really prove anything because really it's an immaterial invisible gardener who's attending to it, and that's why the garden is still going the way it is and we haven't been able to detect the guy. All right, now Flu suggests at this point, as the skeptic would suggest and as you yourself might be thinking at this point, the guy who's believing in the gardening hypothesis is cheating, right? He's cheating epistemologically. He's kind of going through the motions of being scientific about this, but he's not really willing to let his hypothesis or his theory, that is to say his belief in the gardener, stand or fall with the observational data. Instead, what he is doing is agreeing, right, or seeming to agree that this is a scientific hypothesis, it's a testable hypothesis, that there is an observational possibility that will count against his hypothesis, but when push comes to shove and that observational data comes in and counts against his hypothesis, he just changes his hypothesis in a way to protect the hypothesis from the observational data and actually to make it even harder for there to be such things as observational data. So what we have here is an indication of someone who's not really committed to a scientific way of thinking about things, but rather has a pre-scientific notion that come hell or high water, so to speak, he's going to stay with. Now what the behaviorist will say is that when we start thinking about the human psyche, we have to be very careful that we're not doing that same sort of thing, that we really are willing to put our theories about psychology to the observational test. And this is very difficult for many people to do because for many, many centuries we have had this officially intellectual belief in the soul, an officially intellectual belief in the spirit, and in folk psychology and in popular psychology and kind of common cultural understanding of what it is to be a human being. We still have this belief in an immaterial spirit or an immaterial soul, and so that leads a lot of people to resist the idea of deeply the soul or the spirit actually being explainable in scientific terms. For example, if we then go back to the 1500s, to the earliest days of science, there was a lot of anatomy work being done. But one of the common theories about the nature of the soul, if you ask, okay, well, where is this soul? One standard view is to say that the soul resided in the heart, and that kind of makes sense. If we think of the soul as the seat of the passions, the soul is associated with love. Well, we do know when we're in love, right, our heart beats faster, and our passions seem to, in many cases, involve a heating up in our torso area. And so it's kind of a natural hypothesis to think of the soul as located there. But what some of the early anatomists were discovering was, William Harvey being the most famous of them here, is when we look at the heart, as we did, we find that the heart is a pump. And Harvey was the first, as far as I know, to figure out that the heart was connected to a whole circulatory system. The heart was basically just a pump that pumped blood out to all of the parts of our body, and then it had a collection system, all of the veins to bring all of the blood back to the heart in an ongoing cycle. The human heart was essentially the same as the kind of hearts that pigs have in their bodies, that dogs have in their bodies, and you can look at them, and basically it's just a pump, and when we look, there isn't a soul there. There's no spirit there. Instead, what we've done is we've taken something that was thought to be the seat of the soul and performed a reduction on it. It's just a materialistic, physicalistic system right at work here. So then the question is, after the 1500s, well, where then is the soul? And slowly the soul kind of migrates up to the head. It's hanging around in the head somewhere. But then, of course, what's going on as the sciences develop over the centuries is there's more study of the human nervous system, including the brain. And then as we go through all the various parts of the brain and figure out what they do, we're not finding a soul in any of them, or there's no seat of the soul. Instead, what we have is a very complicated physical system. And we can explain all of the parts of the brain and their functions in terms of physicality. No need to bring in some sort of immaterial, spooky, spiritual soul. But nonetheless, what we still have in the 20th century is the idea for many people, well, there's kind of got to be a soul somewhere. We're resisting the idea that everything can be explained observationally in terms of purely naturalistic, physical human phenomena. Okay, so the behaviorists, rather, as in their approach, the psychological approach, are very adamant, right, about being willing to stick to the observational data. If something can't be observed, if everywhere we look we can't find something, then we have to dismiss it. We're going to explain things only in terms of what is observational data.